Well, welcome back to our weekly Bible study series. We're following the Smith and Helway's Formation series. Our unit this month is entitled Evangelism in the Old Testament. Last week we talked about evangelism. We talked about it's the spread of the Christian gospel through preaching or through personal witness. This definition helps us understand that there are two extremes. One is what we say, the other is what we do. This week we'll be taking a look at a story from Genesis chapter 20, and it's actually a what not to do about Christian evangelism. We also see a surprising twist as we see that sometimes God will use outsiders to help him accomplish his work. Let's begin by reading verse 1 of chapter 20. From there, Abraham journeyed towards the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. You'll probably remember back in chapter 12 of Genesis, Abram is called by God into a covenant relationship. God promises to make him a great nation. We see that Abram immediately responds in faithfulness to God and follows God's leading, which is simply to go, to leave home and to follow God, without any real clear understanding of where God's taking him. Well, between that moment in chapter 12 and where we are today, we also see some examples of Abram making some poor decisions. Generally, he gets in trouble anytime he makes major life decisions based on his human instinct as opposed to being patient and looking for God's leading. So as we enter chapter 20, once again, Abram is on the move, and once again, it's because human instinct tells him it's time to go. He needs to move his flocks. So God is not leading him as he enters the land of the Philistines and encounters King Abimelech. Let's continue with our reading. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. So why does Abraham say that Sarah is his sister? Well, we get a clue if we look at verse 11 that says, Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." See, Abraham thought that these godless heathens would see Sarah, would see her beauty, and they would kill him in order to have her. Now, as we look ahead into verse 13, we'll see that this was actually premeditated. "And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her," this is Abraham speaking to Sarah, "This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother." We get a final explanation in verse 12 of why Abraham said that this was his sister. "Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." So through a legal technicality, Abraham defends himself and why he would have basically told King Abimelech that this was his sister, not his wife. You know, our study guide tells us that ancient marriage contracts from that region on occasion would stipulate that a bride's father-in-law must adopt her in order to secure her place in the family. However, we also know that the law of Moses, as recorded in Deuteronomy, specifically forbid the marrying of one sibling. Beginning in verse 3, we read about King Abimelech, and we form an opinion of him that is in stark contrast to our man Abraham. "But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'You are about to die because of the woman who you have taken, for she is a married woman.' Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, 'Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother? I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands.'" You see, our writer wants us to consider that Abimelech, an outsider, has the ability to hear the voice of Abraham's God. Furthermore, he fears God and he knows that God is powerful. Well, here's what's even more surprising is God's next revelation in verse 6. But even more surprising is God's next revelation in verse 6. Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her." You see, in the next chapter, we have the long-awaited birth of Abraham and Sarah's offspring. As this chapter unfolds, we are less than a year away from the miraculous birth of Isaac. God's plans will never be thwarted, but boy, God certainly has to stay alert because his people make some really bad choices. Just imagine what this would have meant for us and for the gospel message had Abimelech and Sarah gotten together. Yes, God agrees that Abimelech is not responsible. Listen to verse 7. "Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours." Here we have God giving Abimelech instructions, and Abimelech obeys. So what does this strange story have to do with evangelism? Well, I think there's at least a couple of ideas for us to consider here. The first idea is the danger of assumptions. You know, what really happened here is that Abraham made some bad assumptions about the people of Gerar and about King Abimelech in particular, and because he made bad assumptions, he ended up making bad choices. You know, we as the church can also make bad assumptions about the very people that God has called us to witness to and to share his love with. For starters, we can make an assumption that somehow they are inferior to us. In our Christian witness, we need to be careful to think that because people have not yet accepted the gospel that somehow they're bad people or somehow they're less than we are. That would be a bad assumption. Another bad assumption is to assume that people that we witness to have no experience with God. We saw in today's story that Abimelech was able to hear Abraham's God and was able to understand the power of Abraham's God and to even obey. So we never want to make the assumption that just because people have yet to accept the gospel message that they have no experience with God. And finally, we can make a bad assumption that somehow they're going to love coming to our church and participating in our religious traditions and experiences. For someone who has never been involved in church, it can be a pretty intimidating place. And quite honestly, there's a big difference between sharing God's love and getting people to join our church. The second thing we can learn from today's story is the importance of integrity. What we do speaks so loudly they can't hear what we say. Verses 9 and 10 from today's text really do a good job of summarizing the type witness Abraham was to King Abimelech. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What were you thinking of that you did this thing?" You know, it's a sad commentary when we read this story of the type of witness Abraham was to Abimelech. It reminds me of a saying about, give me an honest heathen over a dishonest Christian any day of the week. You know, there needs to be integrity of what we do and what we say, and it needs to reflect what we really believe if we're going to be able to be effective witnesses to a lost world. Well, I hope you'll join us next week for our third lesson in this unit entitled Evangelism in the Old Testament. Next week we'll be taking a look at the 5th chapter of the book of 2 Kings, and we'll be taking a look at Naaman's healing. Until then, have a great week. God bless you. See you next time.